Colt Harrington picked up the old man's knife, the way you'd pick up a relic at a yard sale. 2 fingers, slight grimace, held at arm's length like it might be contagious. "Drew, look at this thing." Drew Vasquez glanced over from the prep station, wiping his hands on his apron. He took one look at the blade, carbon steel, dark with age, the handle worn smooth where decades of fingers had gripped it, and laughed. Not a quiet laugh, the kind that carries. The old man, sitting on the bench near the equipment table, didn't look up. He had arrived at the Nashville Convention Center before 7 that morning, before most of the staff, before the organizers had finished hanging the banners for the National Culinary Arts Championship. A security guard had nearly turned him away at the door until he produced his observer badge, a small laminated card, slightly bent at one corner, which he had requested 3 weeks prior by mail. He'd written the request in careful block letters, the way men of a certain generation still do when something matters to them. His name was Roscoe Elbert Dunn. He was 74 years old. He wore a plain grey windbreaker over a white collared shirt, dark trousers with a crease that had survived 30 years of habit, and shoes that had been polished recently but carried the scuff of many miles. His hair was white and sparse, cut close. His hands, spotted with age, rested on his knees with a stillness that came not from fatigue but from a lifetime of waiting quietly in difficult places. He had set his knife roll on the bench beside him without thinking about it. An old leather roll, dark brown, the laces replaced twice over the years. He'd carried it out of habit. 40 years of habit. He was not there to compete. He was there because his wife Eleanor had competed in this room, this exact room, in 1983. She had won. He had finished second. He had pressed his ribbon into her hands and told her she deserved both, and she had laughed and said he was only saying that because she was prettier, and he had said yes, that too. She had been gone 11 years now, and sometimes the only way he could get through a Saturday, without the weight of it becoming unbearable, was to go somewhere that still held the shape of her. Nobody at the National Culinary Arts Championship knew any of that. To the young chefs warming up their stations, to the organizers with their clipboards and earpieces, to the sponsors in their lanyards and branded polo shirts, Roscoe Dunn was simply an old man on a bench, who had wandered in early and didn't seem to know what to do with himself. "Hey, Pop!" Colt Harrington walked the knife over, grinning, and held it out. "This yours?" The old man looked up slowly. "It is." "Mind if I ask how old this thing is?" "Older than you." Harrington laughed and set the knife back on the roll, not carefully. "I'll bet. Listen, we've got a serious competition running here today. Maybe better to keep the antiques in the car, yeah? Wouldn't want anyone to hurt themselves." He said it with a smile, the kind that was technically polite and functionally cruel, and walked back to his station without waiting for a response. Vasquez had already moved on. They had a competition to prepare for. The old man looked at his knife for a moment. Then he set his hands back on his knees and looked at the room instead. The National Culinary Arts Championship was not a small event. It drew professional chefs from 17 states, all of them under 40, most of them with culinary school credentials and restaurant credits and social media followings that the judges had been instructed not to consider, and almost certainly did. The stations were equipped with induction burners, immersion circulators, vacuum sealers, Thermomix units. Technology that cost more per piece than Roscoe Dunn's first car. The competitors moved through their prep with the precise confidence of people who believed they were very good, because most of them were. The competition organizer, a heavy-set man named Neil Barker, had been running this event for 9 years. He knew every sponsor, every judge, every equipment vendor by first name. He was good at his job. What he was not good at, on this particular morning, was paying attention to the quiet old man sitting near the equipment table. He glanced at Roscoe once during setup, assumed he was a retired judge or a vendor's grandfather, and moved on. The dismissal was polite, unconscious, and entirely complete. Roscoe Dunn sat with his hands on his knees and watched the room fill up. He watched the way a young woman on Station 3 held her paring knife, grip too far back on the handle, wrist compensation that would tire her out inside 20 minutes. He watched a man on Station 7 season his mise en place with the mechanical efficiency of someone following a checklist rather than tasting. He watched Harrington on Station 2 set up his induction burner with the casual confidence of someone who had done it 1,000 times and trusted the equipment completely. He said nothing, he simply observed and waited for nothing in particular. At 9:47 in the morning, 18 minutes before the first judging round, Station 6's induction burner died. Not a flicker. Gone. The display went dark, the surface cooled, and the chef at that station, a young man named Brett Colley, stared at it with the specific panic of someone whose plan has just collapsed and who has no backup. Neil Barker was there in under 30 seconds, phone already out, dialing the equipment vendor's technical support line. The technical support line put him on hold. The hold music was "Don't Stop Believin'," which felt, under the circumstances, like a personal affront. "Can we borrow a burner from another station?" someone asked. "We can't move equipment mid-competition. It's in the rules," someone else said. "So what exactly do we do?" Harrington, watching from Station 2, called across the floor, "Maybe ask the old man. Bet he's got something useful in that ancient kit of his." He meant it as a joke. Several people laughed. Roscoe Elbert Dunn stood up. He picked up his knife roll and walked towards Station 6 with the unhurried gait of a man who knew exactly where he was going and wasn't interested in performing urgency for anyone else's benefit. "Sir, this is a competition area. I'm not sure you should be." A volunteer started. He held up one hand, not aggressively, just firmly, and knelt beside the induction unit on the floor. "Sir, we have tech support on the line." He wasn't listening. His hands moved along the base of the unit with that same deliberate touch he had used on 100 pieces of field equipment in 100 places where the nearest repairman was 200 miles away and the food still had to be ready at 1800 hours. He found the panel latch, eased it open with his thumbnail. Inside, a wire connection had vibrated loose. A failure point he recognized, because he'd written a maintenance note about this exact brand of unit in a field equipment report back in 2009 that had, apparently, not made it into the manufacturer's product literature. From the breast pocket of his windbreaker, he produced a short length of electrical wire, the kind of thing most people would call clutter. The kind of thing that certain men carry forever because they have learned, in very specific circumstances, what it costs to be without one. The repair took 60 seconds, maybe less. He pressed the reset on the back of the panel. The display lit up. The surface began to warm. Brett Colley stared at the burner, then at the old man, then back at the burner. "How did you—" "Loose connection." Roscoe Dunn straightened slowly, one hand on his knee for support. "Should hold for the day. Get it properly serviced before the next event." He turned to walk back to his bench. Wait. It was Harrington. He'd crossed the floor without quite realizing he was doing it. His voice had lost its easy mockery. "Can I ask you something? Those knives of yours. Can I see one properly?" The chef's knife. Properly this time. Roscoe Dunn set his knife roll on the nearest table and drew out the carbon steel knife, the one Harrington had dismissed an hour ago, and held it out, flat across his palm. Harrington took it, turned it over, ran his thumb carefully along the edge. His expression changed. "This edge. How is this possible on a blade this age? Carbon steel takes an edge better than most modern alloys if you understand what you're doing. Harder to maintain, but worth the effort." Roscoe drew out a small whetstone from the kit, dark, worn to a concave hollow in the center where thousands of blade passes had carved their mark over decades. "Your own knives are good, but they're not as sharp as they should be. You're rolling the edge when you strop. I watched you do it earlier." Harrington stiffened slightly. "I've been sharpening knives for 15 years. "I know, I can see that," he said it without condescension, simply as an observation. "May I?" A pause. Then Harrington handed over his own knife, a custom Japanese juto he had bought in Tokyo for more money than he liked to admit. What happened next, several people would try to describe in the days that followed and find they couldn't quite do it justice. There is a kind of skill that has been refined past the point of being teachable by words. It lives in the body alone, in the angle of the wrist, the pressure of the fingertips, the rhythm of the stroke that comes not from thought but from something done so many thousands of times it has become structural, like breathing. Roscoe Dunn made 3 passes on the whetstone. 3, same stone, same angle, same unhurried motion. He handed the knife back. Harrington tested the edge against his thumbnail. His face went very still. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. The old man didn't answer. He was rolling up his kit. Neil Barker had watched the last 5 minutes from across the room. He approached now with a different bearing than he'd had all morning, slower, less certain, clipboard at his side instead of raised and ready. "Sir," he said, "I want to apologize. When you came in this morning, I should have introduced myself properly. I'm Neil Barker. I run this event. Can I ask, are you here as a guest of one of our competitors?" "No." Roscoe Dunn set his knife roll back on the bench. "I requested an observer badge, sent the form in by mail." Barker stared. You wanted to watch?" "My wife competed here once, a long time ago." He looked at the room for a moment. "I come every few years, sit in the same area she used to warm up in." A pause. "It's a fine room." Something shifted in Neil Barker's chest. He was not a sentimental man by trade, but he had been doing this job long enough to recognize when he was standing in the presence of something whose full dimensions he didn't yet understand. "May I ask your name, sir? Your full name?" "Dunn, Roscoe Dunn." From the judges' table 15 feet away, a woman looked up. She was 68 years old, silver-haired, with the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime standing at attention. Her name was Iris Caldwell, and she had been a judge at this event for 11 years. Before that, she had chaired the culinary arts curriculum at the Culinary Institute of America's New York campus for 16 years. And before any of it, she had been a 22-year-old extern who had spent a summer at the Army Culinary Arts program at Fort Hood, Texas in 1981, assigned to learn field kitchen operations under an instructor whose patience and precision had quietly altered the course of everything she would go on to do. She set down her pen. "I'm sorry," she said, rising. "Did you say Roscoe Dunn?" The old man turned toward her. The clipboard slid out of Neil Barker's grip and clattered on the floor. He did not notice. Iris Caldwell walked across the room the way people walk when their legs are moving before their mind has fully caught up with the decision. She stopped 3 feet from him and looked at him with an expression that held, in equal measure, recognition and something very close to reverence. "Master Sergeant Roscoe Elbert Dunn," she said. "Fort Hood, the Army Culinary Arts program." The old man's face, which had held the same quiet, slightly sad expression all morning, shifted, a small, careful acknowledgement of being seen. "I was there a long time ago," he said. "I know." Her voice was composed, but only just. "I was an extern there in 81. You were the senior instructor. You told me that feeding people was the oldest form of care that existed, and that anyone who thought it was lesser work than surgery or engineering had never been in a room where people were hungry and afraid." The room had gone completely still. "I have said that to every class I've taught for 40 years, Iris Caldwell said. What the room learned in the minutes that followed, first in pieces, then in the full weight of it, was this. Master Sergeant Roscoe Elbert Dunn had served 26 years in the United States Army, the last 18 as senior instructor at the Army Culinary Arts program at Fort Hood. In that role, he had trained over 3,000 military food service specialists, the men and women responsible for feeding soldiers in every theatre of operation the Army conducted between 1979 and 2005. He had developed the field nutrition protocols that were still in use. He had written the emergency substitution manual, the one that told you what you could cook when your supply chain had been destroyed, and you had local ingredients, field equipment, and soldiers who needed 3,500 calories a day to remain mission capable. That manual had been cited in an after-action report from Operation Iraqi Freedom as a direct factor in preventing a nutrition-related readiness failure that could have grounded an entire battalion. He had received the Meritorious Service Medal 4 times. He had been nominated for the Legion of Merit. He had declined a civilian consulting contract with the Department of Defense because he did not want to spend his retirement in conference rooms. He had come to Nashville today alone in a grey windbreaker with a worn knife roll and an observer badge he'd requested by mail, because this was where Eleanor had stood 40 years ago, and on the hard Saturdays that was reason enough. Colt Harrington had gone very pale. He stood with his arms crossed and uncrossed and crossed again, the gesture of a man who needs something to do with his hands and cannot find anything. "I didn't know," he said. It came out smaller than he intended. Roscoe Dunn looked at him for a long, even moment. "No," he said, "you didn't." It was not absolution, and it was not condemnation. It was simply the truth, and it landed with the full weight of it. "You made an assumption." The old man's voice was quiet, but it carried, the voice of someone who had spent decades making himself heard in loud places and difficult conditions. "You saw old tools and decided they were finished. You saw an old man and made the same call. That is a habit that will cost you, and not only in kitchens. The most experienced person in any room is not always the one with the newest equipment or the loudest confidence. Sometimes they're sitting on a bench near the door, waiting to be asked." He paused. "Or not waiting. Sometimes that part doesn't matter either." Vasquez, who had said nothing since the moment Iris Caldwell had spoken, quietly removed his hat and held it at his side. It was an unconscious gesture, the kind the body makes when the mind is trying to show respect and doesn't have the right words for it. Outside the convention center, a dark government-issue sedan pulled into the service entrance and stopped with purpose. The woman who stepped out wore army dress uniform, her chest carrying a record of service in miniature, ribbons and badges that required fluency in their language to read correctly. Colonel Adela Strom had driven 40 minutes from Fort Campbell after receiving a text from a former colleague that said only, "Roscoe Dunn is at the Culinary Championship in Nashville. Thought you should know." She had not hesitated. She came through the floor entrance and found him standing near the bench, surrounded by the kind of quiet that settles over a room when something important has just happened and no one quite knows how to move, yet. She crossed the floor directly to him. Roscoe Dunn turned at the sound of dress shoes on concrete. Colonel Adela Strom came to attention and rendered a salute with the crispness of someone who learned the gesture from a man who still believed it meant something. "Master Sergeant Dunn." Her voice was steady and clear. "I trained under your program in 1999. I came in as a specialist, fresh out of AIT, and I was certain I understood field kitchen operations because my test score said so." She met his eyes. "You spent 20 minutes with me at a field station in a training exercise and demonstrated through questions I couldn't answer how little I actually knew. Not by telling me, by asking a pause. In Ramadi in 2004, when our supply convoy was hit and we had nothing but what was on hand and what I could source locally, I fed my unit for 9 days on your methods. Every soldier stayed mission capable. I have wanted to say thank you for 20 years, and this is the first time I've had the opportunity." The old man returned the salute with the economy of a man who has performed the gesture 10,000 times and still means it every time. "You did the work, Colonel," he said. "I only asked the questions." "You always said that." "It's always true." Neil Barker cleared his throat and recovered whatever remained of his professional composure. "Master Sergeant Dunn," he said carefully, "I would like to extend an invitation on behalf of this event and personally for you to demonstrate, not to compete, to demonstrate. Whatever that means to you, whatever you'd like to cook, we would be honored." Roscoe Dunn looked around the room once more, the competitors, the judges, the volunteers, the colonel standing at a respectful distance, the 2 young chefs who had spent a morning learning something they would carry for the rest of their careers. He looked at the station near the window, the one closest to where Eleanor used to stand, when she was warming up her hands and going over her prep in her head, lips moving slightly, the way she always did when she was thinking hard about something. "What do you have left over from prep?" he asked. Barker blinked. "Leftover prep material?" "Whatever didn't make it into the competition rounds. Trimmings, ends, offcuts, stock vegetables. Anything that was going to be thrown away." 10 minutes later, a sheet tray appeared with a collection of things that looked, to the young competitors watching, like a generous interpretation of waste. Carrot tops and onion ends, the heel of a fennel bulb, a small piece of chicken trimmed too aggressively by someone's nervous hands, the dark outer leaves of a leek, half a cup of white wine that had been measured out and then set aside, a parmesan rind. Roscoe Dunn looked at the tray for a moment without touching it. Then he tied on a plain white apron from the supply cabinet. Nothing special, the kind volunteers wore, and he began. He did not move fast. That was the first thing people noticed, and then the thing they couldn't stop watching. Every other chef on that floor operated with the controlled urgency of competition, quick hands, constant motion, the focused efficiency of someone racing a clock they could hear ticking. Roscoe Dunn moved with an entirely different quality, deliberate. each action fully completed before the next one began. Carrot tops into cold water, onion ends halved across the cut, the smell rising sharp and clean in the air, fennel heel, leek leaves, a pot of water on low heat. "He's making stock," someone said near the back. "Just stock from the scraps." But then the piece of chicken went into a dry pan. No oil, no butter, just the bare surface and carefully managed heat. And the sound it made was not the aggressive sizzle of high temperature, but something quieter. He was rendering, not searing, drawing out what was already there, rather than imposing something from outside. 22 minutes. At the end of it, he carried two things to the judge's table: a small bowl of golden stock, clear as autumn light through a window, with a depth of smell that reached the far edge of the room, and a plate of pulled chicken resting in what turned out to be a rough vegetable essence, reduced from the stock with the white wine and the parmesan rind, that tasted, according to the first judge, who raised it to her lips, and then the second, and then the third, like something that should have required hours of work and ingredients that cost real money. Iris Caldwell was the last to taste. She set her spoon down and looked at the plate in silence for a long moment. "This is exactly what he used to teach," she said softly, not quite to anyone in particular, "that the most honest cooking is the kind that has nothing to prove, that meets what's there and works with it instead of against it." She looked up at Roscoe Dunn across the table. "You haven't changed at all." "The principles haven't," he said. Colt Harrington found him near the exit at the end of the afternoon. He stood in front of the old man with an expression that held none of the ease it had worn at the beginning of the day. "I owe you an apology," he said, "a real one, not because of what I found out about you today, because of how I acted before I knew any of it. That was wrong, and I was wrong." Roscoe Dunn regarded him for a moment. "The fact that you know the difference between apologizing for what someone turned out to be and apologizing for how you treated them, that's something. Not everyone can tell those apart." He held out his hand. Harrington shook it. "Your grip," the old man said quietly as he released it, "on the chef's knife. Pinch the blade, not the handle. More control, less fatigue, better feel for what the food is doing." "Yes, sir," Harrington said. "Thank you." Neil Barker framed the photograph himself. He had taken it without planning to. A quick shot on his phone. During those 22 minutes, the old man in the plain white apron bent slightly over the stove, afternoon light coming in from the window the way it used to come in when this room was younger, and so were the people in it. He had it printed large and mounted in the registration area, where every competitor checks in each year. Below it, a card in a simple frame. Roscoe Elbert Dunn, Master Sergeant, United States Army, retired. He came to watch, he stayed to teach. He asked only for the scraps. Cook like you have nothing to prove and everything to give. Roscoe Dunn drove home that evening on the interstate with the windows down, the way Eleanor always liked it. The grey windbreaker was folded on the passenger seat. The knife roll sat in the back, where it always sat. He didn't think of himself as a legend. He thought about the stock, how clear it had come out, how the leek leaves had contributed that faint green note at the finish, how the parmesan rind had done exactly what it always did when you gave it enough time and enough heat and didn't rush the thing before it was ready. There was a lesson in that, he supposed. There always had been. He let the highway carry him home.